Hello, in this video, Kayla Hammond Larkin and I are going to explain the concept of a visual abstract, give some context as to what visual abstracts are, explain why you may want to use them to promote your work, and also give you a quick introduction on how to create a visual abstract. So looking at the title here, Sharing Scientific Research with Twitter-Friendly Graphics, you may be asking yourself, why do I need to do that? As a scientist, as a researcher, as a doctor, people see my work in places like PubMed. My peers know who I am. So why do I need to actually share my work via Twitter? This is a perfectly valid question, and I'm going to try to explain as to why you might want to do that. But first, some context. When I started as a librarian back in 2006, when we worked with faculty on questions about promoting their work, they usually only knew two things about their publications. They usually knew which paper they had was the most popular. I wouldn't say necessarily cited the most times, but the paper that people kind of knew about the most. And that was usually based solely on how many emails they had gotten from people asking for reprints or if they could borrow their data set. And they also had a rough idea of how many papers they had written, usually just as the first author, not necessarily keeping track of the papers they made a different contribution to. So with that in mind, around 2007, with the introduction of new metrics like, say, the H-index, people became much more comfortable, much more familiar with thinking about how their work actually impacted other researchers. So they got to be aware of things like the impact factor for the journals they chose, things like number of times cited, sort of that kind of traditional metric impact of their work. But as I got more familiar with these different types of metrics such as time cited, they also became aware of the limitations. So one of the limitations on any of these traditional metrics is the time lag. So example, here's a paper published by Sarah Ketchen-Lipson, a professor here at BU School of Public Health. I'm making this video in September of 2019. This paper was published in September of 2019, so it's a very new paper. So this is actually a very important, well-regarded paper. But because the paper just came out this month, it has no traditional citations yet. We know that sort of historically, it usually takes about 9 months for people to start citing your work and new original papers. You may see some citations in editorials or comments to the editor, those sorts of publications, but people being actually citing you in their original work takes usually about 9 months. Another aspect we know about these limitations is actually the scope of a source. So a database like PubMed tends to only look at peer-reviewed journal articles. The database Embase looks at peer-reviewed journal articles and some conference proceedings. Web of Science looks at peer-reviewed journal articles, some conference proceedings, also some textbooks, but that's clearly not everything that you do. Especially now in 2019, if someone's blogging about your work, if you're interviewed for the New York Times or the Boston Globe, if you're on a broadcast network, that's really an important way to inspire people, to reach people, to influence people, to disseminate your work. And those sorts of resources aren't tracked by these traditional metrics like time cited. So with that in mind, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, we started to see the advent of something called altmetrics. So these are sort of 3 of the biggest altmetric companies out there. So kind of confusingly, altmetric is a company, brand name, altmetrics is the idea. It's kind of like referring to a politician as like a capital D Democrat or a lowercase d Democrat, one being the actual proper name of that organization and one being kind of the philosophy. Plum Analytics and Impact Story are also other altmetrics companies out there. Impact Story you might want to check out on your own. It does a good job for you as an individual of kind of tracking the impact that you have had with your work. But thinking about altmetric as a resource we license at BU, if I take a look at one article in particular, and again, here is that Dr. Lipson, again, we just showed her paper a second ago. This very first article here, number 1 in this list, you can see this is that paper I showed this slide of a moment ago that came out earlier this month in September. So you see she has no traditional citations yet, and I can see that if I look just right here, this is kind of the altmetric sort of data visualization that BU licenses. So she has no traditional citations yet, but her work has been seen 425 times using an altmetric score, and I'll show you that in a second. Back to my original point too, if you look at this the third article here, you can see that this paper came out in January of 2019, so 8 months ago from the time of this recording. And as I said, you see a few of these kind of traditional citations starting to creep in now, so it's been cited 9 times in traditional sources, but still that pales in comparison to its altmetric score. It's a 9 as opposed to 348. But if I were actually in her altmetric page now, and again, if you're a BU faculty person, it's going to be linked to your profiles page. You can see these altmetric sort of information icons right here. If I were in BU profiles and clicked on that, it would take me to this page. This is the page for that article on the altmetric homepage. And you can see that it tries to give you some information about the results that came back. They call this a rosette, their sort of indicator. This is the overall score of sort of the social media uses of this particular article. To zoom in on this a bit, you can see that, so it has a score of 425. So it's been mentioned in 42 news outlets by 4 different blogs, 2 Facebook pages, 1 Redditor page, but 121 tweeters. So we know that when we look at anything in altmetrics, usually it's people on Twitter, so-called tweeters, that use your resources the most often. And you might ask yourself at this point, why do I necessarily want to know what that is, or why is that important? Well, there are some very influential people out there who do have Twitter accounts. So say, for example, as of the time of this recording, the #1 Twitter user in terms of impact is actually Barack Obama. As of today, he has about 108 million followers. So that's obviously quite a few people. So if you sort of like what Barack Obama represents, I certainly do, and if you think that the people who follow him are sort of your kind of people, so people of integrity, educated people, open-minded people, rational people who are interested in making the world a better place, you certainly might want the people who follow President Obama to follow you, which is great. I will say, though, just due to sort of the celebrity-driven status aspect of Twitter, the #2 and #3 most followed users as of today, Katy Perry and Justin Bieber, might not have the same sort of following of people, of your peers scientifically. But keeping that in mind, though, there are about 1 billion people in the world do have Twitter accounts. So some of those people, it stands to reason, are also scientists, also communicators, also your peers. So if we were to go back to that page on Altmetric for Dr. Lipson's paper again, you can see that Altmetric gives you a breakdown here of your Twitter users. So it says, of these people, the 121 people who had tweeted about her paper, you can see that 21 people, or 18%, are scientists, identified as scientists by Twitter. 8% are practitioners, so doctors, other healthcare providers, professionals, and 6% are science communicators. So roughly a third, I think it's 32% of these people are really Dr. Lipson's peers, really the people she wants to reach. So even if there are, say 108 million followers of even Justin Bieber, some of those people are probably the people you actually want to reach, your direct peers. You can even drill down on this a bit further, again, back from the altmetric page. You can start to click on those people who tweeted about this paper individually, and it shows us that these are some of the people, just the top 4 that come back up in this original search, but this Dr. Agenor is a professor over at Tufts, so again, kind of a direct peer, a professor at a medical school to Dr. Lipson being a professor here at BU. And even probably the most important thing here, you don't see it very well, so I'm going to kind of zoom in on that. It shows us that upper bound. So there are 233,000 potential people who have seen this particular tweet. So if that sort of ratio holds true, so if roughly 32% of those people who saw this tweet are our direct peers, that's about 75,000 people who are physicians, who are science communicators, who are scientists. That's kind of a great pool of people to try to capture using Twitter. But even thinking of the opposite, so that means there's roughly 150,000 people who aren't scientists, sort of the general public. We also want to try to capture those people too. Because we know that if we take a look at this next slide here, when people have their own activities for finding scientific information, sometimes they don't do a great job. So this recent Pew Research Center survey from 2017 said that only 17% of people are active science consumers. They actually go out and try to find science news on a regular basis. 30% said they get it because they're looking for it, but not on a regular basis. Maybe they just saw something on TV and now they're interested about that particular topic. This same survey says that 26% of adults do follow science accounts on social media, and 33% consider this to be an important way to get their news, their science news, which is great. Because we know that sometimes when people left to their own devices make choices of things they think might be sort of credible information sources, they don't always get it right. So for example, again, at the time of this video was made in September of 2019, This particular title was the number 8 bestseller on Amazon under the category of vaccinations, and it was the number 23 bestseller under autism. And you can see that from the blurbs of the reviews of this book. This book has a very distinct sort of perspective that autism is caused by mass vaccinations. I don't think that that is the prevailing opinion in medical science today. But this is, again, the number 8 bestseller for under vaccinations on Amazon right now. So thousands and thousands of people who want sort of a balanced, rational, open-minded, unbiased view of this particular topic are buying this book. And this book does not have sort of an unbiased opinion. It's a very particular slant. So even if people are trying to buy what they consider to be a reliable information source, a book from Amazon, in some cases they're not going to make what we consider to be probably the right choice, or the best choice, I should say. Okay, so with that in mind, if I've made the case that you should definitely consider Twitter as an avenue for getting your work out there, not only to your peers, but also to influence the general public, what's the best way to do that? Well, I'd say right now in the fall of 2019, sort of the hottest method people are using to communicate their scientific findings on Twitter are something called visual abstracts. So a little bit of background here. Visual abstracts began in 2016 in the journal Annals of Surgery. They're now used by more than 50 publishers, including JAMA and BMJ. And they're also used by organizations trying to communicate directly to the public, like the CDC. So what is a visual abstract? A visual abstract is the graphical depiction of the material one would usually see communicated in a print abstract. So rather than just having that paragraph in PubMed describing what your work is all about, this is a way to describe that, or actually to depict that visually. By convention, it's usually limited to a maximum of 3 images or image areas, kind of like a triptych, like in a medieval painting. And if you want to think about it in a really kind of nice way as a takeaway, it's sort of an elevator pitch done with images. So what you want to do, you can't communicate everything in your work, obviously, in a visual abstract. You want to think of kind of the 3 most compelling aspects of that research and describe that, or I should say depict that in a visual way. You also want to be careful because you're pitching this not only at your peers but a general audience. So you want to be careful to sort of tone down the jargon. You want to avoid sort of scientific terms like number needed to treat or risk ratio or absolute risk, any of those sorts of things that the sort of a general reader and the general public wouldn't necessarily understand. You can certainly communicate those, but maybe in a sort of a broader way. So here's a couple of examples. So here is a visual abstract I found online that sort of follows that classical model. And then Kayla's going to talk about this more in her part of the presentation. But so normally you have a title describing sort of what the research question is, or it could be the same article title of the article is from which it came. So you can see the first panel here, it's just 3 icons. And you want to show underneath the icons sort of what the overall effect of that research was. So you want to show in this case this number of patients decreased, the shorter length of stay. So the idea is that you're trying to show broadly that some benefit was sort of derived from this treatment. So fewer people needed blood transfusions, they stayed in the hospital a shorter amount of time. I'm also going to show you this next one here from the CDC. This is one sort of pitched more to general audience. So you can see that it's kind of written in easy to understand language, but it's still pretty effective in communicating the message the CDC wants to get across in this case, to certainly treat this particular condition to prevent heart disease. And you can see that normally too, that at the bottom of the visual abstract itself, you want to link back to the article, the original article from which this came. Because the idea is that, again, if one of your peers is now reading this on Twitter, you want to give them the chance now to go back to the actual journal article, read the entire thing. Because, of course, if they read it themselves, they download it at some point down the line, they can cite it, which is kind of the overall sort of benefit of people reading your work. But also, so the general public gets a chance to understand it, but you want to give your peers a chance to get their hands on the paper so they can cite it traditionally and use that in their own work. So are visual abstracts effective? Maybe the best way to show that is actually using a visual abstract itself. So this is by Andrew Ibrahim. He's sort of the father of visual abstract. He's done a lot of work about using visual abstracts and creating them. And we have some links to some of his resources here on how to create a visual abstract on your own. He has a nice primer on how to do this as well. But you can see they do lead to more people retweeting your work, more people do see your work, and then more people do go to that journal article page itself to download those, or at least look at those articles and then download them after the fact. So we do know this is an effective strategy, again, as of 2019. We definitely want the general public to be aware of what we're doing in science. We definitely want our peers to be aware of what we're doing in science. And as of right now, this is the most effective way of visual abstract to do that using a social media platform like Twitter.
Hello, my name is Kayla Larkin, and I am an Education and Information Services Librarian at Boston University's Alumni Medical Library. And today I'm going to be presenting part 2 of our discussion of visual abstracts. Now, my esteemed colleague and mentor, David Flynn, just finished telling us what a visual abstract is and why you would make one. What I'm going to talk about now is how to make a visual abstract. As Dave mentioned earlier, Dr. Andrew Abraham is sort of like the godfather of visual abstracts. And the diagram shown here is actually borrowed from his website, and what it shows are the component parts of a typical visual abstract. Now, not every visual abstract will look just like this. It really depends on the content of the paper your visual abstract is based on. But in general, you might up at the top have a heading that summarizes the key question addressed in your paper. In the center, there's usually a summary of the outcomes that are discussed in your paper, including usually a statement of the outcome comparison, some sort of visual display of the outcome. Here, icons are used. And then any data that you want to present that's related to your outcomes. Now here they presented 3 outcomes. You don't have to show 3 outcomes, but it is kind of typical. 3 is kind of like a magic number. In the bottom left-hand corner, you usually have a citation for the paper, including the names of the author or authors, where and when the paper was published, and then sometimes you might want to include the DOI or permalink where people can find your paper online. Finally, in the bottom right, you might include a logo for your institution, like Boston University, or for the journal where the article was published. Now, what this diagram provides is some guidance on the basic structure of a visual abstract and kind of the general content it should contain. So what we have here are the bare bones, pretty much, of visual abstract. But what this diagram doesn't quite tell us is how to make a visual abstract that's good. So how can we make a good visual abstract? How do we catch someone's eye and hold their interest long enough so that they can engage meaningfully with the research we're presenting to them in visual form? To answer this question, to figure out how to make a good visual abstract, we need to think about what, more broadly speaking, makes a good visual design. So let's zoom out for a minute and think about what is the point of making a visual design, any visual design at all? What do we want a design to do for us? Scott Clemmer is the director of the UC San Diego Design Lab, and he has a really neat Coursera course that I've linked to that discusses the goals of design, which I've listed on this slide. He talks about how design is about trying to make the information that matters to us come through clearly. And in order to achieve this, a design should guide people by conveying structure, relative importance, and relationships. A design should set the pace of the interaction to draw people in, to help orient them, and provide hooks for them to dive deep. And a design should express the message of the information that matters to us by giving it meaning and style and breathing life into the content. And this last point is particularly relevant when we're creating visual abstracts, when we're taking information that was originally in one form, in the form of a scholarly journal article, and transforming it into a new form, in visual form, in the hopes of engaging new audiences with our work that we wouldn't have reached otherwise. So now that we have a better idea of what the goals of a design are, we need to figure out what we, the designers, need to do to actually achieve those goals. So in a nutshell, a designer's job is to select the appropriate design elements and apply the appropriate design principles. So let's talk for a minute about what are design elements and design principles anyway. So let's start out with design elements. What are design elements? They are kind of like the building blocks of what makes up a design, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, a visual abstract, whatever. These include points, lines, shapes, colors, values, space. I'm kind of reminded of something my fifth grade art teacher, Mrs. Olansky, used to say, which was, shapes and lines make designs. So now let's turn to design principles. Design principles are pretty much the rules that we follow when we select and arrange the elements of design, like shape, line, color. And basically, how well we apply these design principles to the selection and the arrangement and the employment of design elements determines how good our design turns out. Some examples of the principles of design are listed here: rhythm, balance, unity, proportion, contrast, dominance, and more. So now we know what the goals of a design are, and we know that in order to achieve those goals, we have to select the appropriate design elements and apply the appropriate design principles to those elements. But that's easier said than done. In his Coursera course that I mentioned earlier, Scott Clemmer talks about how applying design principles is kind of like playing the board game Othello. It takes a minute to learn, as we've seen, but a lifetime to master. And so you might know that you don't match stripes with plaid because it doesn't look good, but you might not know why it doesn't look good. And you might not really have a good grasp on how to pick two colors or two shapes that go together. In order to truly master the principles of design, you probably have to devote the rest of your life to it and quit your day jobs as doctors and researchers, which would really undercut our main objective of today of creating visual abstracts. Because if you stopped conducting medical research, then we wouldn't have any more abstracts to visualize, would we? So we don't really want to do that. But luckily, we don't have to quit our day jobs and devote our lives to design, because design experts have already done that. They've already devoted their lives to design, and in doing so, they've already done a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And there are plenty of resources out there that outline design best practices, and there are plenty of tools that exist that can help guide us in selecting the right design elements that best serve design principles when we create things like visual abstracts. And today we're going to focus on some tools and best practices that are available for us to reference for three particular design elements that we're going to need to employ in our visual abstracts. So we're going to focus on color, typography, and iconography. But before we get into an in-depth discussion of those elements, we need to lay the groundwork for our visual abstract. So step one is to actually just pick a paper whose abstract we want to visualize. And we can't just pick any paper we want. We have to think about what's a paper whose key points really lend themselves to a visual summary. And so here's an example that we're going to work through today. It's from the CDC, and it's called Trends in Meeting Physical Activity Guidelines Among Urban and Rural Dwelling Adults in the United States between 2008 and 2017. And even from just reading the title of the paper, I can already think about how I might visualize certain sort of key ideas that are described here. And that's a good sign. Okay, so once we've picked our paper, the next step is to pick a program that we're going to use to create our visual abstract. And there's a bunch of different options out there. If you have a design background, if you're like a design hobbyist, a couple of good programs to try out would be, in the Adobe Creative Suite, something like Adobe Illustrator. Kind of the open source and free version of Adobe would be GIMP. But if you're just kind of getting started out with creating design projects, you might want to select one of these programs instead. So we have PowerPoint, which is a paid program, but free for BU staff and faculty and students. And you can check out the BU IS&T page for more information about how you can download this program for free. I would also totally recommend that you check out Dr. Abraham's PowerPoint tutorial on creating visual abstracts. It's just a quick 2-minute video that can guide you through how to create one of those sort of more bare bones visual abstracts that we talked about earlier. A couple more options for programs. Canva is pretty popular with some groups on this campus. A lot of times people use it to create things like flyers and posters, and it's really, you can get great results using Canva. There are both free and paid versions of Canva available, but kind of anecdotally, I have noticed that Canva seems to be moving a lot of their sort of functionality that used to be available in the free version to the paid version. So it does seem like they're moving more toward a paid model as they're kind of gaining popularity. And then finally, there's Google Slides, which is the program we're going to be talking about today. So why did I choose Google Slides as the program I wanted to focus on today? Well, first of all, it's free to use, and as a librarian, I love free stuff. Second, it's very stylish, as I hope you'll agree in a second when I start to show you some of the features and functionality. And finally, it's very collaboration friendly if you plan to work on creating a visual abstract with a friend or colleague. So now let's move into sort of a more hands-on segment of our program today. And so please forgive me as I begin to sort of toggle between various tabs in Chrome. And so to get started with Google Slides, you might want to work off a template slide that you've created from a past visual abstract or that a friend has shared with you. So here's a template that I've made for a visual abstract that you might want to share on Twitter, and I'll show you what that looks like. So this looks very similar to sort of the bare bones anatomy of a visual abstract that I showed Dr. Abraham's diagram earlier in our presentation. And so again, we have a heading that's a summary of the key question being addressed by your paper. The center focuses on outcomes. And bottom left, we have the citation for the article, including the author who wrote the article, where and when the article was published, and maybe a link to the original article, a permalink or a DOI. And then finally, usually in the bottom right, you have a logo for the journal or the Visual Abstract Creators institutional affiliation. Now, in order to preserve the integrity of my template slide, I'll probably just want to make a copy of this slide and work off that copy as I'm creating a new visual abstract project. So I'm going to click File, Make a Copy, and I'll call this Cool Kayla Viz Ab. Okay, so here's my fresh visual abstract that I'm going to use as my jumping off point. So let's go back to our game plan here. So after we've made a copy of our template, we might need to change the slide dimensions in order to optimize the slide for the social media network that we want to post the slide on. And so different social media outlets have different kind of size pictures that work best for posting. And there are a variety of cheat sheets available that you can sort of reference if you're not sure how big a JPEG you need to download ultimately to post on an outlet like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. We're going to be working on a Twitter visual abstract today. And so we'll want to optimize the size of our slide for Twitter. And so we can do that by clicking File, and then we go down to Page Setup. And then we'll usually want to switch inches to pixels. And I've already optimized this slide for Twitter, so 1024 by 512 pixels is usually sort of a best practice for Twitter. And I can click Apply, and it won't change because I've already optimized it for Twitter. So going back to our slide deck here. So after we've made a copy, change the size of the slide, we might want to download the relevant institutional logo. For us, the VizAb creator. So we can go to the BU branding site's collection of logos, which are specific to various departments. And so you can kind of select whichever logo is most representative of your affiliation, and you can upload that into your slide. And then lastly, our sort of last step in getting set up, we're going to want to maybe install some Google Slides add-ons. And as I've written here, Google Slides add-ons are third-party tools that are created by various companies and entities and individuals. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, and their intention is to improve Google Slides' performance and functionality. And I'll explain more on that in a couple minutes when I show you some of these add-ons that we might want to use that are particularly helpful in creating visual abstracts. So once we've got the basic setup of our Google Slide template in order, let's return to some of those design elements that we talked about earlier. And let's start with color and how we can sort of best select the colors that we want to use in our visual abstract. Some best practices for that include creating a palette of colors, so nice colors that go together, in other words, and limiting your palette to 5 or fewer. So you don't want too many colors in your visual abstract. If you need more than 5, you can just vary the shades, tones, or tints of the colors in your palette in order to communicate whatever information is necessary. Another kind of idea is to select colors that reflect your article's subject matter where appropriate. So if your article is about Halloween, you might want to go with orange and black. If it's about the environment, you go with green. Those are kind of silly examples, but I think that you get the gist. And so keeping those best practices in mind, I just want to sort of show you a couple of tools you can use in selecting colors for your visual abstract. The first is called Paletti, or Paletti if you prefer. I'm not sure exactly how it's intended to be pronounced. And that's one of those Google Slides add-ons that I mentioned earlier. So let's go back to Google Slides and I'll show you what that is. So I'm just toggling over to my slide here. And so in order to install a Google Slides add-on, so again, those are those third-party tools that are created to sort of help extend Google Slides performance and functionality. There are paid and free options, but I'm going to focus on free ones today because, again, I'm a librarian. I love free stuff. So we want to go up to add-ons in the toolbar, click that. Then we can click Get Add-ons, and that will take us to sort of a library of available Google Slides add-ons that we can install. So if I want to find Paletti, type it in, and I'll click on it, and that will give me just a little more information about what it is. And so basically, it's a tool that helps you select color palettes, so nice colors that go together for your visual abstract. And so I already have it installed here, so I don't need to install it. So I'm just going to go back to Add-ons, Paletti, and Start. And when I click Start, it will open up a little panel over here on the right with over 200 sort of preset palettes of colors that I might want to use in my slides. And you can kind of remix the colors to add some variety. If you like any of them, you can add them to your favorites. Or you can apply them to the current slide. And that's kind of the basics of how Paletti, the Google Slides add-on, works. Just some sort of color inspiration at your fingertips. Another tool that I wanted to show you related to selecting colors for your visual abstract is a website called coolors.co. So I'll just take you there, coolors.co. And this is another sort of color palette generator, again, helping you select a set of colors that go nicely together to use in your visual abstract. And so I can just click Start the Generator, And after it loads, all I need to do, I don't need to watch the tutorial, I am the tutorial. What I'm going to do is just hit the space bar on my keyboard. What that does is it generates a variety of colors. Again, here we have a palette of 5, just sort of keeping in line with our best practice mentioned earlier. And so if I like a color, I can just hit the lock. And when I do, and hit the spacebar again, it builds a palette of colors around that color of interest. If I know the hex code for a color that I like, so that is just the kind of unique identifier for colors that we see online, I can type it in here and build a palette around that. So I'm going to type in the hex code for the BU color Scarlet that you might have noticed in our merch. So it's CC0000. Here we are. And have it locked down. And if I click the spacebar, Coolors will build a palette around that color. And if I see a color that I want to incorporate in my Google Slides visual abstract, what I can do is I can just copy the hex code for that color, go back over to my abstract and say I want to change the background color of my slide to that color. I'll just click background and then click the color, custom, plus sign, and then I can just type in the hex code, click OK, and done. So the second design element I want to talk about is typography. So basically what fonts to choose to incorporate in your visual abstract. And one rule of thumb is to choose 2 to 3 complementary type families in your design. And so basically that's 2 or 3 fonts that look nice together, such as Rockwell and Laura. Those are 2 Google Slides fonts that you could choose that work pretty nicely side by side. And so within those 2 to 3 type families, you can create a visual hierarchy, help sort of define different types of information by maybe bolding, italicizing, changing text size, etc. But first and foremost, when you're choosing fonts to use in your visual abstracts, you want to prioritize readability. So even if a font looks really cool, maybe it's like some really pretty cursive writing, if someone who's looking at your abstract in Twitter or Instagram or whatever can't read what it actually says, that's a problem. And so how do you figure out what fonts look nice together? Well, there's one tool I want to shout out in particular that I really like called FontPair. It's a website. Let me take you to it. One sec. So here's the FontPair website. And so basically, it focuses on fonts that are available in Google products like Google Slides, and it tells you which ones look nice together, which is exactly our kind of main objective. And so here's some example of some nice pairings. Laura and Merriweather are 2 fonts that work nice together. Prosa Libre and Open Sans. Libre Baskerville and Source Sans Pro. And you get the idea. And so you can sort of browse through this site for some, type inspiration. Or if you have a favorite font and you want to know what goes nicely with it, like so we could let's type in Laura. And it says 9 font pairings found. And so what FontPair is doing is it's providing some ideas for some fonts that complement Laura nicely, such as Roboto, Istock Web, Nunito, Open Sans, etc. And so if you find a pairing that you like, you can go over to your slide and you can start to incorporate these different font pairings. And so here's Laura. And so let's say if I wanted to select Merriweather. If there's ever a font listed on this site that you don't see in your fonts drop down in Google Slides, you can just click the More Fonts button and then search for whatever font you'd like to add. to your drop-down, and then click OK. So the last design element I want to talk about today is iconography. So basically what pictures you might want to include in your visual abstract. And these pictures might be, very well the most memorable aspect of your visual abstract, and they could really make or break it. And so some best practices to keep in mind are that, really you don't want to include pictures that are overly detailed or complicated. You really want people to be able to look at your visual abstract quickly and really easily digest what's going on. So simple, clear illustrations and charts really best convey the information included in your research in visual abstract form. You also want to make sure to keep the style of the pictures, images, charts, icons, whatever, consistent across your visual abstract. So you want them to all look like they're in the same sort of picture family. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are some cases where photography might be appropriate as opposed to diagrams, charts, icons for your visual abstract, but it really depends on the subject matter. And some tools that you can use to help you select images to include in your visual abstract are listed here. And these are really handy because it can be pretty tricky sometimes to find images online that are free for you to use lawfully. And so these tools really help with that. And so this first one here, Insert Icons for Slides, that is a Google add-on. And so I'll just take you over to our example slide here, show you how to find that. So we'll go back to our slide, and again, to install and find new add-ons for your Google Slides, you just click Add-ons and then Get Add-ons, and then you can look for the add-on that you want to install. Insert Icons for Slides, there it is. And so I already have it installed, so I'll just show you what it looks like once it's installed. So I'm going to go to Add-ons, Insert Icons for Slides, Open Sidebar to select icons. And so what it presents you with are two icon libraries, one from Font Awesome and one from Google's Material Design Library. And so there isn't an endless number of icons available here. Again, they're all free. This add-on is free, and these icons are licensed for you to use. And if with a little bit of creativity, you can probably find a good icon to cover whatever outcome or other information you want to convey in your visual abstract. And you can also change the color of the icon by selecting here from sort of this drop-down. Or if you know the hex code for the color that you want to use, you can type it in. So again, I'll go with my BU Scarlet here, CC0000. And then I can search for an icon I might want to incorporate. So I'll just type in arrow. Here's a bunch of different arrows. If I want to incorporate one in my abstract, I'll just click it. And then I can move it and resize it as I see fit. Another add-on that I want to show you is called Unsplash Images. And this add-on can be used for finding photographs. So I'm going to go to my add-ons toolbar, and I'm going to go to Unsplash Photos, Insert an Unsplash Photo. And that opens up a little panel here on the right, and I can just search. I'm going to search for apple, just as an example. Enter. There's a few very lovely apple photographs. If I see one I like, I can click it, and it automatically sets the image as the slide background. But what you can do if you double click it, you can recrop it and resize it as you see fit very easily. There we are. Beautiful. The last sort of kind of tool you might want to use when you're thinking about what sort of pictures to incorporate in your visual abstract is the Google Slides insert chart function. And so as I mentioned earlier, sort of a best practice is if you want to include a chart or graph, just make sure it's simple. Use something like a simple pie chart, a simple little bar graph. Just something that's easily digestible, easily understandable with a quick glance from your viewer. And if they're that interested, they can go and see the full paper to really dig deep and see the more detailed charts and graphs that you may have included. But if you want to include a simple chart or graph, all you have to do is click Insert, and then we can go Chart. And let's say I want to make a pie chart. Click Pie. And what this gives us is sort of like a generic pie chart. And so if I want to customize it, I can click the little chain or link here and open source. And what that does is it takes me over to Google Sheets with the data source. And I can edit the data to match the data I want to present for my paper. I can delete rows, change information, and then I can customize the look of the pie chart. If I click Edit Chart, and I can customize here the colors and the font that is used, and I can use that to match the fonts and the colors that I've used in the rest of my visual abstract. And once I am satisfied with the look of my chart, I can go back to my slide and click Update, and the changes that I've made in Google Sheets are reflected in Google Slides. And I just wanted to show you guys sort of the final product of a slide that I was able to create using Google Slides and some of the tools that I just mentioned. So I'll just click on it here so we can get a closer look. Okay, and so here's a visual abstract that I created based off that CDC article that I mentioned earlier about trends in physical activity among American adults in urban and rural areas. And so up at the top again we have a heading that's like sort of summarizes the key question addressed in the article. In the center we have some panels, usually a set of 3, like a nice and neat triptych addressing some outcomes related information presented in the article. In the bottom left, we have a citation for the article, who wrote it rather, where and when it was published, and then sometimes you might want to include the DOI or permalink to the actual paper. And then finally, in the bottom right, we have the BU School of Medicine logo, if you want to include your institutional affiliation. And again, we were able to download these from the BU branding website I showed you earlier. And so some tools that I used in creating this slide, I used Coolors.co and Paletti for some inspiration about creating sort of a color palette of nice colors that go together here. I used that website FontPair to select some complementary fonts presented here. The icons I incorporated, I got from the Google Slides add-on, Insert Icons for Slides. And I was able to create this little pie chart using Google Slides Insert Chart feature. And so once you're happy with how your slide looks, you can download it. Click on File, Download. And usually you'll want to download it as a JPEG. That's usually a safe bet for uploading, I would guess, for most social media networks that you would want to post your visual abstract to. And then I'll just take a look here for some sort of final steps. So again, you download the slide, And then you can upload it to your social media network of choice, say Twitter, for example. And then you just, again, want to make sure that you're linking back or providing a link to the original paper somewhere, whether it's in the slide itself or as a URL written in the post accompanying the uploaded image. So before I say good night and good luck, I just want to point out a few additional resources that you might want to peruse as you're thinking about getting started creating your own visual abstract. One idea is to check out the Twitter hashtag visual abstract for some design inspiration, for some examples of other visual abstracts that you might want to emulate. So here's a nice one from BMJ. Dave showed you, I think, some BMJ visual abstracts earlier. They create very strong work, as you can see here. Some other information sources include, we've talked about him a lot, Dr. Andrew Abraham's primer on creating visual abstracts, sort of like a how-to guide, getting started creating a basic visual abstract. And you can see some additional resources, including a PowerPoint tutorial, how to create a visual abstract with PowerPoint, on his website. Finally, we just want to thank you all for watching this tutorial today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions you might have. You can usually find us hanging out at the front desk of the 12th floor of the library, or you're welcome to reach out to us online. Our contact information is listed here. And good luck with creating your own visual abstracts. We cannot wait to see them.